to pull out the notes that I put there because I think that those notes will help you follow along as I speak this morning. I'd like to actually start off with a strange question for you this morning. And the question goes like this. Have you considered how your image can get distorted? Have you considered how your image can get distorted? Did you know that in this digital age that psychologists actually have a new term called digital distortion? Yes, digital distortion. And digital distortion is a term that psychologists are using to describe things like photoshopping images or using filters to blur imperfections or enhance body features on social media platforms. And there was a recent survey that was actually done recently, and they found that approximately 80% of girls have changed or altered their image by using a filter by the age of 13 years old. 67% of girls indicate that they've hidden or changed a body part while using an app online. You see, psychologists define digital distortion as the attempt to control a person's image. And it probably comes to no surprise to you that human beings have been trying to control their image for centuries. Did you all know that in 1562, the Queen of England, then Queen Elizabeth, who, by the way, she became queen at a very, very young age, at 25 years old. And when she became queen, she actually was diagnosed with smallpox, and she almost actually died. But miraculously, she survived. But unfortunately, due to the smallpox, she got scars all over her face due to the skin lesions that came on her face. And so the queen, who believed that her power was actually in her beauty, covered her face with that white, iconic makeup that queens wear. And she also decreed that no painting could be painted of her unless they could find that most talented artist, that perfect artist that could paint the most perfect picture of Queen Elizabeth. And so she went through hundreds of paintings, hundreds of artists, until she could select that one image that she thought was best. And this image was the one that got actually selected. And her image of her face actually got copied into all the future images into the future. You see, the queen wanted to control her image. Now, you're probably thinking, and you know, that image distortion goes way beyond just correcting or photoshopping images. Many of us remember the slap that was heard across the nation during this year's Oscars event. And we'll never forget when famous actor Will Smith actually slapped Chris Rock. And if you remember, Chris Rock made a very inappropriate joke about Will Smith's wife, Jada Pinkett Smith. And Will Smith, in his anger, stormed the stage and slapped Chris Rock across the face. And although Will Smith apologized at the end of the Oscars ceremony when he received his Best Actor's Award, he didn't actually apologize to Chris Rock till what? Like a day or two later, right, from that event. And did you know since then that according to Vanity Fair magazine, Will Smith had ranked in the top 5 to top 10 most positively ranked actors pre-slap, they call it, pre-slap. But actually, he was actually next to Tom Hanks and Denzel Washington. But post-slap, Will Smith saw a dramatic decline in his image, a drop of almost 40% following the assault on Chris Rock. And now, I don't know if you've seen this in the news, but this month, Will Smith has been on a public campaign to repair his public image as he's trying to promote his new film. And while Will Smith is trying to make sure that his public image is being restored, there's all these articles that are coming out that are saying that he's actually distorting his own image while he's trying to actually control it. It seems like image distortion through image control is simply part of human life. Have you considered how your image can get distorted? And this actually brings us to today's text that we're going to see in Daniel chapter 3. You're going to see in this particular chapter about a man who actually distorts his very own image by trying to take control of it. And this person is King Nebuchadnezzar. And now this morning, I'd like for us to actually read from the NASB translation, which, by the way, is a word-for-word translation from the Hebrew and Aramaic. And I think you're going to see why I chose this translation here in a second. And so let me read this to you. But as I read, I'd like you all to actually pay very close attention to the color coding that I placed on the screen, okay? So follow along with me here. It's a long passage, but here we go. It says, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent word to assemble the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, and the magistrates, and all the rulers of the province to come to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces were assembled for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the heralds loudly proclaimed, "To you the command is given, O people, nations, and men of every language, that at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast in the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. Therefore, at the time when all the people heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipe, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. For this reason, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. They responded and said, "Nebuchadnezzar the king, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipe, and all kinds of music is to fall down and worship the golden image." Every time I read that, I told the first service that I like to move my arms like this. Hear the sound of the horns, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipe, and all kinds of music to fall down and worship the image that he has set up. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast in the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. There were certain Jews who you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have disregarded you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and anger, gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then these men were brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you're ready, at the moment you hear the sound of the horns, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipe, and all kinds of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, very well. But if you do not worship, you will immediately be cast in the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give an answer to you concerning this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver you from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we're not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with wrath, and his facial expression was altered toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He answered by giving orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than it was actually heated, or usually heated. He commanded certain valiant warriors who were in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in order to cast them into the furnace of blazing fire. Then the men who were tied up in the trousers, their coats, the coats, the caps, and other clothes, and were cast in the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. For this reason, because the king's command was urgent and the furnace had been made extremely hot, the flame of the fire slew those men who carried up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire, still tied up. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astounded and stood up in haste, and he said to the high officials, "Was it not 3 men we cast and bound into the midst of the fire?" They replied to the king, "Certainly, O king," he said. "Look, I see 4 men loosened and walking about in the midst of the fire without harm. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the furnace of blazing fire. He responded and said, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out, you servants of the Most High God, and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out in the midst of the blazing fire. The satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's high officials gathered around and saw in regards to these men that the fire had no effect on their bodies of these men, nor was the hair on their heads singed, nor were their trousers damaged, nor had the smell of fire even come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, "Blessed be God, the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel," or actually messenger, "and delivered his servants who put their trust in him, violating the king's command, and yielded up their bodies so as not to serve or worship any god except their own God." And all the people said, Amen. Now, the reason I chose the NASB translation here is because the translation shows how the actual biblical authors were intentional with the repetition of certain phrases, as you can see. And the reason why there is so much repetition in this passage is in order to draw our attention to the actual word image in this text. The word image. You see, the word image in Aramaic, salem, is the same Hebrew word. And it's used 16 times total in Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 3. And it's translated as image, idol, or statue. And as we just read the NASB version, we saw how 4 distinct phrases reoccur to draw our attention to the word image in this passage. We see the repeated phrases such as, set up the golden image. Nebuchadnezzar sets up a golden image. He then summoned the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces to hear the sound, the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipe, and all kinds of music. You are to fall down and worship. And we saw the repeated phrase, whoever does not fall and worship will be thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. And while we, the readers, can see how much importance that Nebuchadnezzar is actually placing on his image in the story, at the same time, we, the readers, through these repeated patterns, right, can see how, in fact, Nebuchadnezzar is actually distorting the biblical intention of man's image. You see, we all know, according to the Bible, that Nebuchadnezzar is clearly distorting man's image, his own image, and God's image all at once. And we know this because we all remember the opening pages of the Bible. Actually, in the very first poem in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 to 27, it states this. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. What this means is that God's intention for you and me, for mankind, for male and female, is that you and I would actually reflect God's image, if you can think about that. When you think about your image, do you often think about how your image reflects God? Or is your image prone to distortion? Here in Daniel chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar distorts the biblical image of God and the image of man. And he actually does it in three ways. And I've actually placed these three distinct ways in your notes so that you guys can follow along with me. And my prayer actually this morning is that you and I can actually learn how we ourselves are prone to image distortion. And I hope that actually we can actually learn this Christmas season how God has always been on the move for image restoration. You see, if you look in your notes, it says the first distinct way that Nebuchadnezzar distorted man's image is by setting up a false image to be served. Nebuchadnezzar distorted man's image by setting up a false image to be served. Again, it's through the repetition where we see how the king sets up this false image. It's the repetition of the phrase, the image of gold, that Nebuchadnezzar sets up. And it's actually found in verse 1, in verse 2, 3, 5, 7, verse 10, verse 12, verse 14, verse 15, and verse 18. 10 times in this story. And with this phrase, I believe that the biblical authors are actually zeroing in on the inauthenticity of Nebuchadnezzar's image of gold. And I believe that the biblical authors here are stating that when people set up an image, that there's something false and there's something fake about it. Have y'all heard of the new app that came out 2 years ago called Be Real? The Be Real app started out of Paris 2 years ago in 2020. Leave it to the French to come up with an app like this. The French, they don't like things that are fake, right? So they came out with this app. And they actually seen a huge explosion this year in 2022. 74% this year alone of growth for the Be Real app. Because Be Real, this app was created due to digital distortion. It was created as an anti-influencer, as a social media app. And the Be Real app notifies, I don't know if you know how this works, but the Be Real app notifies users of a friend group that at the same time during the day, everyone in the group has 2 minutes to actually post what they're doing at that particular moment. So you only have 2 minutes to post. And the goal is actually to give the user's friends an unedited, unfiltered glimpse of their everyday lives, what's going on during the day. There's no likes, there's no follower counts. It's all just supposed to be given in those 2 minutes. And so the Be Real app actually emphasizes authenticity. And now this is actually resonating amongst teenagers because these teenagers are realizing that social media is a bit fake. Can I get an amen for that? All right. I think that people, they just intuitively know that when we set up an image, that there's something false and there's something fake, and even possibly something idolatrous about setting up an image. I have a friend that lives outside of Texas, and this friend posts every day images of himself. sometimes up to 10 images or 10 selfies of himself within a day. No comment. Now, you might be thinking, well, what's so wrong with then making an image like a statue? I mean, we see statues all the time. Like this is a statue of Michael Jordan, but there's Abe Lincoln at the Lincoln Memorial, and this particular statue of Michael Jordan was set up right in front of the United Center in Chicago. Well, in order to actually answer this question, it's important to know the why behind why Nebuchadnezzar was inspired to set up his own image. And actually, if you look here on the screen, you'll see what was actually happening in chapter 2, in the previous chapter. You'll read that Nebuchadnezzar had a dream about a statue with a gold head, a silver torso, iron legs, plus iron mixed with clay feet. And the statue actually gets destroyed by a huge rock. And although this dream is actually very perplexing to Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel does in fact interpret this dream for the king, stating that each part of this statue represents a very large kingdom. And Daniel, in fact, interprets that the head of gold is actually supposed to represent King Nebuchadnezzar himself. Look what it says in verse 37 to 38. It says, "You, O king, are the King of kings, to whom the God of heavens has given the kingdom, the power, the strength, and the glory. And wherever the sons of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, or the birds of the sky, he has given them into your hands and caused you to rule over them." Listen to this. You are the head of gold. So this dream probably inspired King Nebuchadnezzar to set up and to erect this huge golden statue from top to bottom here in chapter 3. But we see the problem with this statue with the next repeated phrase found in verse 5, verse 7, verse 10 and 15. That when you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you are to fall down and to worship. You see, the issue was that Nebuchadnezzar sets up this idol statue to be worshipped and to be served. You see, Nebuchadnezzar did not pay attention to the words that Daniel spoke in verse 37. He says, "O king, you're the King of kings, to whom God, the God of heaven, has given the kingdom, the power, the strength, and the glory." You see, somehow Nebuchadnezzar disassociated that his kingdom, power, and strength came from God alone. You see, worship and service belongs to God alone. What King Nebuchadnezzar is doing is called idolatry. It's idolatry. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself now, who sets up images to be worshipped these days? And who are these people that are setting up images to be worshipped and idols, all over the place? We don't see that. This is so old school, and this is so of the past, But if you understood how the Bible actually defines idolatry, you can actually see idols in our everyday life today. You see, according to the Bible, and according to Habakkuk 2:18, idolatry is defined as people trusting in their own creation. Habakkuk 2:18 says, "What profit is an idol when its maker has shaped it? A male image, a teacher of lies. For its maker trusts in his own creation when he makes speechless idols." Has it ever occurred to you that the human race is trying to manufacture something that it can fully trust? Now, I don't think that technologists will ever call what they're doing as, trying to make a god or something like that. And Kai-Fu Lee, I don't know if you guys read this book, AI, Superpowers, China, Silicon Valley, and the New World Order. He would definitely disagree with the idea that science is anywhere close to actually building an AI platform that knows all things like God. But Kai-Fu Lee, who actually has a PhD in AI and is an investor in AI companies in China, does affirm, and I quote, he says this, "With current AI technology, there is a belief that we are on the verge of achieving what some consider the holy grail of AI research, artificial general intelligence, or AGI, which are thinking machines with the ability to perform any intellectual task that a human can, and much more." And in his book, AI Lee tells how he took the survey of all these scientists who are in the AI field, right? And he says that all AI scientists predicted that by 2040, 18 years from now, that they'll have an AGI that will almost be like human and will know more than humans. And my son Eli at the time will be actually 32 years old. at that particular time, 18 years from now. And I think the point here that we can take away is that the human race is indeed racing. We're racing against other countries like China, attempting to be the first to create a super intelligent AI platform. Next, the Bible defines idolatry as people wanting to become like their created image. The Bible defines idolatry as people wanting to become like their created image. Psalms 115:8 says, "Those who make idols will be like them, and so will all who trust in them." This is a picture of a filmmaker who has a camera eye now, and then this is a guy who has a servo motor arm. Elon Musk says humans actually will deepen our ties with technology even further, to the point where we become cyborgs as a way of upgrading our inherent natural abilities. He continues, over time we'll be closer to merging our biological intelligence with our digital intelligence. It's all about the bandwidth of the brain. Well-known scientist James Lovelock says that cyborgs will replace humans and remake the world. And actually, Ray Kurzweil, a director of engineering at Google, envisions a radical future in which humans and machines have merged together. He believes that we will upload our minds into the cloud. And he predicts a constant renewal of our body through intelligent nanobots released into our bloodstream. Kurzweil predicts that by 2029, 7 years from now, we'll have computers that are AGI-like, with intelligence like humans and much more. And that we'll actually reach this point of what he calls singularity, where all this stuff comes together and actually takes over humans by 2045. You see, today, you and I are actually wearing our technology and we're carrying our technology. But for the days of tomorrow, powerful people like Elon Musk and Ray Kurzweil foresees the day when we will become our inventions. And finally, the Bible defines idolatry as when people look to their created image for deliverance. The Bible defines idolatry as when people look to their created image for deliverance. Isaiah 44:17 says, "For the rest he makes a god his idol. He bows down to it and worships. He prays to it and says, 'Deliver me, you are my God.'" And this particular article from the New Yorker is like many articles. There's so many articles about quantum computers. It talks about how scientists are building quantum computers, more powerful computers than we have today. And quantum computers, as they're being invented, they're looked to, and the reason why they're being invented, to help us and to deliver us from climate change, from food scarcity, as well as crime. So now people, they're not even looking to God anymore for deliverance. People don't want to look to God for help or deliverance. People in today's world have their sights set on technology to be their deliverance. Now, I don't think that people will ever call AIs or cyborgs or quantum computing their God, but do they really need to? It's the same themes of the Bible. According to the Bible, they trust in their own creation. They want to be like the image of their creation, and they look to the image of their creation as a source for their deliverance. It's all the same themes that we see in the Bible. And if you think that these examples of idolatry are a little bit too futuristic, well, how about just the example of plain old money as being an idol? I don't think that many of us can deny the fact that we often look to money for deliverance. And I think this is why in the church is always so cautious about the love of money. When I was actually a non-believer, I never really understood how Christians could tie idolatry to the love of money. But now it's very clear to me when I read Habakkuk or Isaiah, or actually I read the Psalms. You see, money is trusted, although it's man-made. People have this perception of wanting to be $1 million man. And often people look to money as a source for their deliverance in their life. So this actually begs the question for you and me. What false images are being set up in your life today that's leading you to image distortion? The second distortion that we actually see in this text is that Nebuchadnezzar distorted man's image by consolidating rulership around himself alone. Nebuchadnezzar distorted man's image by consolidating rulership around himself alone. We actually see this through the repeated phrases in verse 2, 3, and 27. Then he summoned the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So actually, we can assume when we read this that Nebuchadnezzar is consolidating rulership around himself because of the type of people he's summoning. They're all people of very high positions. And then on top of that, the text says in verse 4, all peoples, nations, and men of every language was summoned. Did y'all happen to know this interesting fact that the first recorded history of image control happened in 1530, 3,000 years ago, with this pharaoh named Akhenaten? And both history and archaeology states that this pharaoh so wanted to control his image that he attempted to remove all the multiple gods in Egypt in order to control it. And the reason why is because kings were always associated to gods in the ancient Near Eastern world. So Akhenaten wanted to consolidate all the power around himself, so he got rid of all the polytheistic gods that were in Egypt so that he could create this one sun god called Aten, very close to his name, sun god called Aten. You see, in the ancient Near Eastern world, kings were always associated to deities or gods, just like in this story of Nebuchadnezzar. But what makes this Bible so fascinating, and this is so amazing, this is so radical, and it's so cool, and it's actually found in the first chapters of the Bible. And if you look at the text around the first poem of Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 to 28, it says, "Then God said, 'Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all creation, all creatures that move along the ground.' So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, 'Be fruitful, increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea, and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground.'" And the reason why this image, this biblical image, is so radical is because every single person was created to rule in the image of God. Not just people of high power and high positions. If you are trying to find meaning in your life, if you're trying to find motivation to live in your life, know that you were created to partner with God in ruling. You see, this is not even a democracy we're talking about. You see, a democracy still has rulers, but we're not even supposed to rule over each other. We're supposed to rule over the fish, the birds, and every living creature that crawls on the ground. It's not even a democracy. This is such a radical idea that the Bible is introducing in the first pages of the Bible. And this is so radical for two reasons. First, it states that we, as men and women, are supposed to share with God in ruling with him. So this means that God is extremely generous. We have a very generous God that wants you to partner with him to rule. And if you don't believe me, you can read Psalms 8, 4 through 8 that says, "What is man that you take thought of him, and the son of man that you care for him? Yet you made him a little lower than the angels, and you crown him with glory and majesty. You make him to rule over the works of your hands. You put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, all the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens, and the fish of the sea, whoever passes through the paths of the sea." And the second reason sharing in God's rule is so radical for men and women like yourselves and like me, it shows that God, you're going to love this, God is the only one who's supposed to be our king. We're supposed to have only one king, that being God. In other words, there was never meant for there to be rulers other than God himself. And if you don't believe me, read Psalms 8, 6 through 8, that says this. You guys remember when the Israelites were trying to make Saul their king? It says, "But when they," the Israelites says, "give us a king to lead us, this displeased Samuel, and he prayed to the Lord. And the Lord told him, 'Listen to all that the people are saying. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. As they've done this from the day I brought them out of Egypt until today, forsaking me and serving other gods, so are they doing to you.'" There was only supposed to be one king, and that king was God. Isn't that amazing? That's the most radical concept of the image of God that you can find anywhere. That we're supposed to share in God's rule, and that God was the only one who was supposed to be our king. to be our king. And so what this means, for those of you in the corporate world, this is a flat org chart. One day, we'll have a flat org chart, and we're going to just report to God himself. And this actually brings me to my final distortion that we see actually in this text. So actually, so far, we see Nebuchadnezzar. He's set up a false image to be worshipped and served. He's consolidated all rulership around himself. And the third and last final distortion we see is Nebuchadnezzar distorts man's image by believing that no one can be delivered from his image of ultimate authority. Nebuchadnezzar distorts man's image by believing that no one can be delivered from his image of ultimate authority. You see, with this final repetition of the phrase, whoever does not fall in worship will be thrown into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. Found in verse 6, verse 11, verse 15, 17, 20, 21, 23, and 26. But you'll actually notice something amazing happen in verse 15 through 17. Because with these verses, an inversion begins to happen, starting in verse 15. It says, now, if you're ready, at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you are to fall down and worship the image that I made very well. But if you do not worship, you will immediately be cast in the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire. And he will deliver us out of your hands, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. You see, this story is about how God has the ultimate authority and how God ultimately can deliver you and me from any god out there or any authority out there. And you know what's really awesome about the book of Daniel is that the book of Daniel is actually highly structured. And if you look at the book of Daniel, chapter 2 actually links to chapter 4. And chapter 3, which is the story about the three men in the furnace, the fiery furnace, links to Daniel in the lion's den in chapter 6. And there's all these hyperlinks between those two chapters. And what's amazing is if you look at this, the word deliver in Aramaic is repeated over and over in chapter 3 and chapter 6 to show us that this is about God and his ability to deliver. And between these two hyperlinks, it shows us how God is going to deliver it. But with this particular story in chapter 3, what ends up delivering Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is another image. In verse 25, Nebuchadnezzar says, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound, unharmed, and the 4th looks like the son of the gods. And this word look in this text is a very uncommon word used in the Bible. And sometimes it's translated as resembled, and actually not used very often, but it links to Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, when God says, let us make man in our image and in our likeness. Same word. And what's amazing about this image in the furnace of blazing fire is that this image represents or is like the Son of God. Isn't that awesome? And this image does indeed deliver the 3 men. But what's amazing about this particular image is that this image delivers them within the fire. Meaning that this image of deliverance not only delivers them from the fire, but this image of deliverance delivers in the fire, within the fire. Think about that for a second. The image of the Lord God. He comes to be with men in a humble way. He doesn't do it to exalt himself, but he lowers himself as a person in the fire with the men. You see, there's something about God who's willing to go with, who's willing to go in, and is willing to go through your trials and your tribulations or your fires in life. Are any of you facing any fires or tribulations in your life today? If so, you should know Isaiah 43, 2 through 3, that says, I will be with you, and when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned, and the flames will not set you ablaze. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. You see, this image of God comes into the furnace of blazing fire, and this image is so radical because it comes to be with the men. And this passage in Daniel chapter 3 begs this question for us, you and me, as we read it. If there could be an image of God, the complete image of God, reflected in an image of man, who would one day come not to set up a false image of himself, right, but would be the true reflection of God's image. An image that would come not trying to delight and trying to consolidate rulership around himself, but would build a kingdom, that would build a culture where people would not rule over each other, but they would serve each other and that they would love each other. And if there could be a man who could come to deliver us all, who are distorted by suffering, by not saving us necessarily from it, but by walking with you and me through our sufferings in order to restore our image in the refiner's fire. You know, could this image in the furnace be a pointer to Jesus? Colossians 1:15 states, He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. 1 Corinthians 15:24, then the end will come when he hands over the kingdom of God, hand it over to God the Father, after he's destroyed all dominion, authority, and power. Could this image in the fire be a pointer to Emmanuel, God with us? God with us. Jesus came to earth to complete an image restoration project, not through a way that we expected, by exalting himself like the world does, but by entering into our fiery furnaces with us. That's how he enters, with his image. And this is to give us hope that our image actually could be fully restored even through our pains, our trials, and our sufferings. And the Apostle Paul actually says in Romans 8:29, he says, for those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, so that he would be the firstborn among many brethren. The Apostle Paul actually what he meant was that we were supposed to be conformed to God's image, Jesus' image, by persevering in our sufferings, by loving our enemies, by blessing the not so blessed, and by leading, by serving, not lording it over other people, or nor exalting ourselves with pride. You see, in the ancient Near Eastern world, many people would place a dead image of stone or iron or wood in the center of their temple to represent their God. But the opening chapters of the Bible, God actually builds a temple. And in his temple, he calls earth, he places an image. And that image is not dead stone, wood, or a type of metal, but that image is living. And that image is actually you and me. Isn't that amazing? The story of the gospel is how you and I actually became broken images of God. And we actually got confused on what our image is supposed to look like. But now, through Jesus, we all are now moving toward image restoration. That's the gospel. And we actually can all sing joy to the world because Jesus has come to complete the greatest image restoration project the world has ever seen. This Christmas, I'd like you to ask yourself a couple questions. What image is placed in the temple of your heart? What image is placed in the temple of your heart? Have you pondered the image of Jesus who is in you? And when you look back at actually 2022, have you through Jesus restored any distortions in your image? And are you looking to Jesus not only to save you from your fiery furnaces, but to restore you by walking with him through our pains, our trials, and our fires in life? Let's pray together. Father God, we just, this Christmas season, Lord, it's so easy to get off the meaning of this season of life, of Christmas time. And it's we get so busy with the buying of gifts, the meeting of friends and family, the taking a break at the end of a long year